So, what do you do? This is a common question that comes up in social gatherings, dinner parties, weddings, networking events, TED conferences. Now, if I were to ask you the question right now, what do you do? Think about how you would respond. What would you say? And more importantly, how does it feel to say that? Now, on the surface, what do you do is a common question. It's just an innocent conversation starter, right? But on another level, you might feel like there's some sort of judgment involved. Judgment about how important you are, how successful you are, how useful you are, based simply on what you do for a living. And have you ever noticed that there are times in your life when you enjoy getting that question, and then there are times in your life when you don't enjoy getting that question? So for example, you might enjoy getting that question if you've just been promoted, or maybe you're working for a highly respected organization. And you might not enjoy getting that question if you've just been laid off and made redundant, or maybe you're not feeling passionate about what you do. Well, it turns out most of us aren't feeling passionate about what we do. In Gallup's most recent State of the Global Workplace poll that covers 142 countries, they found that only 13% of us are feeling fully engaged with our work. And yet there's a tendency to maintain the trajectory of our careers. After all, our careers are part of our identity, right? And sometimes it's hard to let go of who you've been for so long. Imagine if you were to do that, if you were to let go of who you've been and to walk away from one career to pursue another. Well, that's exactly what I chose to do 12 years ago, what I chose to do again last year. And it's what I feel we all must do sometimes to evolve our careers as we ourselves evolve. So today I'd like to share with you my own personal story of career change. 3 lessons I learned when standing on the cusp of change, which I hope will be useful to you if you're also pondering a change in your own life. And finally, wrap up with talking about a few questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're trying to clarify whether it's time for you to move on. Now, right now, when I get asked the question, what do you do? I actually enjoy getting the question. And I enjoy giving my response. I tell people that I coach individuals to develop who they are as a brand and to relaunch themselves during times of change in their careers, their lives, and their organizations. And part of the reason why I enjoy doing this kind of work is because my own career has gone through its own set of transformations over the years. You see, 12 years ago when I was asked that question, what do you do? I was actually dreading the question, and I was ashamed of my response. But before I get into that moment, let me explain to you how I reached that point. Now, as a small child, you're not asked the question, what do you do? You're asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And when I was asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, I would tell people, I want to be a doctor. And this is something I decided at the age of 5, when I had to go to the hospital to get some stitches on my left eye. You can still see the scar. And from that moment on, I thought, you know what, I want to do that because I was so impressed with that doctor's ability to fix me up. 10 years later, a competing interest came up, and that was in business. I love the idea of starting something from nothing, of marketing an idea, of creating a solution to a problem. And so I got a business license, and I started a small business in the basement of my parents' home in Springfield, Missouri, called Joe's Discs. And I sold blank floppy disks, which were a hot item at the time. Now, that didn't exactly work out and become the next Amazon for a lot of reasons. One reason is because right when I was developing that interest in business, another event occurred in my life which squashed that interest before it had a chance to really blossom. At the age of 17, I was playing tennis one day, and I felt a sharp pain go through the right side of my chest. And it felt like the air was knocked out of me. And it was later diagnosed as a primary spontaneous pneumothorax. Now, this happens to about 7 out of 100,000 people. And it's when your lung spontaneously collapses on itself, and it makes it very difficult to breathe. Now, by the time the doctors caught this and diagnosed it properly, it had gotten pretty bad, so they had to shove a metal rod between my ribs and perform a chest surgery to reinflate it and reattach it. Now, I took all this to be a sign that actually, you know what, maybe I should become a doctor. You see, there are 2 stories that take place in all of our lives. There is the story of what actually occurred, so the factual events, and then there's the narrative that we overlay on top of those stories to make sense of those events, especially when those events are painful. And so the narrative that I decided I wanted to write was something along the lines of becoming a doctor one day, equipped with this insight of knowing what it's like to be a patient. And then I did what we all do when we have a goal in mind. I began to invest myself in it. So I spent the next 4 years at Northwestern University studying the pre-medical sciences. I majored in psychology because I loved human behavior, but I also thought it would be useful to know that as a doctor. And I also spent 3 summers doing medical research. And as I was going through this, I began to feel what a lot of people tell me they feel if they aren't feeling 100% satisfied with their careers. I would wake up each morning and I wasn't really looking forward to the day. Or I would not feel like I was making the most of who I am. And I was actually kind of feeling quite depleted in terms of my energy. But I carried on anyway. I took the 10-hour exam to get into medical school, and as I became more invested in this narrative, it became harder and harder to extract myself from it. Next thing I know, in 2002, I matriculate to the Georgetown School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. And I remember being at the white coat ceremony where you take the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, and I felt incredibly conflicted. Because on the one hand, I was proud of having reached this goal in my life, to be surrounded by all these people who are going to make such a noble contribution to society. But on the other, I was deeply unhappy. I felt trapped. And I remember being in gross anatomy lab the second week of medical school and holding the human heart in my hands and looking down at this pair of lungs and this cadaver, being reminded of this organ that failed me so many years ago. And I thought, well, here I am. Is this still where I want to be? And it was one of those moments where you feel like you realize that, you think you know where you want to go in life, and then you get there and something's a little bit off. And I remember looking around at all my classmates furiously dissecting their cadavers and scribbling in their lab notebooks, and it was a moment when I felt incredibly misplaced. You ever feel that, when you feel like you're wearing the wrong shoe, and no matter how hard you try, it just doesn't fit quite right? And it was at that moment that I realized I had a pivotal decision to make. I could either finish what I started, or I could quit. And I didn't actually know what I wanted to do, but I knew at that moment it was no longer this. And so after only the second week of medical school, I withdrew from the program, unraveling all that I invested to get there and bringing this nice narrative to an abrupt end. I went from being the 3% of applicants that get into medical school to the only 1% of students that drop out. And when someone asked me the question, what do you do? I had to say, well, I just dropped out of medical school. And it was at that moment that I felt like a complete and utter failure. And with no job in hand and no idea what I wanted to do next, my career suddenly hit rock bottom before it actually even began. And from that moment on, I became fascinated, almost obsessed, with this tension that exists between maintaining the status quo of our lives and moving on to something new. Which gets me into the second part of my talk, the 3 lessons I learned when standing on the cusp of change. When I left medical school, when I moved from the US to the UK 4 years ago, and when I left my corporate marketing job last year to launch Illumity Coaching. And the first lesson has to do with the paradox of goals. Now, sometimes people ask me, well, what took you so long, Joseph, to get off that road to becoming a doctor? You saw the signs. Why didn't you just quit earlier? The truth is, I don't really know. I don't know why we don't get off of the road earlier when we feel like something's not right. What I do know is that I'm an incredibly goal-oriented individual. And maybe you're the same way. Maybe when you set a goal, you'll do everything you can to achieve that goal, no matter what the cost. There's something admirable in that. What's interesting is that there's a double-edged sword when it comes to goals. On the one hand, goals provide our lives with intention, with direction, with purpose. But on the other, they're incredibly limiting. They can prevent us from being open to other ideas and other interests that pop up along the way. And that's because sometimes it's hard to see clearly when you're moving so fast toward a goal. I set my sights on becoming a doctor, and as strange as it sounds, I never took the time to look up and make sure I wanted to go there. I just got on the train of life, and although it was uncomfortable, I just kept on riding the train because there's actually comfort in knowing you're going somewhere. And what I learned from all this is that detours lead to discovery. That if you are willing to step off the road and take the long way around, even if it seems like initially it's a distraction, that it at least opens up the opportunity for you to discover a path forward that resonates more effectively with who you are and what you want from your life, not just what you feel you should want from your life. The second lesson has to do with the stubborn power of investment. Now, after I left medical school, the good thing was I was able to kind of pick up the pieces and I rediscovered my interest in business. That spark I had when I launched Joe's Discs, and I did not go launch another floppy disk company. Instead, I spent the next 10 years working in brand management and marketing for both large and small companies in the US and the UK. I went from studying gross anatomy to marketing gross products initially. So I started on bin liners and trash bags, and then moved on to drain opener. And then it got better. I moved on to luxury desserts and most recently luxury ice cream. And I got a chance to work on new product launches and also brand relaunches. And I always found the brand relaunches to be much more interesting because you have a chance to reinvent and reinvigorate a brand in a way that represents its future, not its past. I got a chance to rename a company, to redesign a package, to launch a brand's first national ad campaign. And interestingly enough, during those times, there was an interesting dynamic where there was a tendency for there to be a tension between ingrained legacy of a brand and potential opportunity. And everything that had been invested in building that brand prevented people from wanting to change and evolve that brand. So I would hear things like, well, we can't change the name of our company because although that would be a more versatile name, people won't understand what we do anymore. Or we can't change the way this package looks on shelf. Although it would modernize it, consumers won't be able to find us on shelf anymore. Or we can't launch this new ad campaign because it would allow us to reach new consumers, but our existing consumers are going to feel alienated. Now, Daniel Kahneman is a very well-known psychologist at Princeton University, and he stated that we prefer certainty over uncertainty, that we prefer avoiding a loss over receiving a gain. And I think that helps to kind of explain the parallel dynamic that happens in our careers, where there's a tendency to maintain the logical stories of our careers. This is the idea of never giving up and never giving in and finishing what you start. There's something quite admirable in that. Nobody likes the person who stands up in the middle of a movie theater and walks out in the middle of a movie, even if the movie is bad. I've only done it once. It's actually very tough to do. And what I learned from all this is that sometimes moving on is harder than holding on. That sometimes investment is so strong, it's the one thing that's keeping you from progressing your life forward. But recognizing that that dynamic exists is actually the first step toward being able to cut your losses and move on, especially when your intuition is telling you that this surely is not as good as it gets. The final lesson has to do with the upside of chaos. Now, when I left medical school, everything was thrown up in the air, but my interest in business reemerged, and I was able to grab onto it and run with it. When I moved from the US to the UK 4 years ago, everything was up in the air for me again. It was very chaotic. I had to rebuild my life, restart my career here, but I was reminded of how much I actually thrive on this idea of building something from nothing. And just over a year ago, when I was getting ready to transition to a new brand management role, my father passed away. And I was reminded of life's fragility, the same way I was reminded of life's fragility when I had that collapsed lung. And it made me kind of slow down and reevaluate my life. And it made me realize I wanted to shift my life from building and relaunching products to building and relaunching people. And I didn't want to put it off. The point is that transitions are messy. They are ugly. They are not pretty and they are not fun. It's like being on a highway and trying to get off on the interchange. You always end up in a traffic jam. But sometimes that's the only way to get off and get onto a new direction. And what I learned is amidst chaos lies opportunity, the opportunity to rediscover who you really are. Because when you're feeling lost, all the boundaries in your life, they disappear. And when the boundaries are gone, anything's possible. And you can move in a new direction. A new opportunity can emerge. Finally, to wrap up, with these lessons in mind, I thought I'd share with you a few questions that you might want to consider asking yourself if you are on the cusp of change and maybe you're wondering if it's time for you to move on. These are questions I ask myself at every fork in the road. And I think they're simple questions, but they're not always easy to answer. And the first question is, what keeps you here? Second, what is that costing you? Because while staying put is serving you in some way, there's always an opportunity cost, always. Finally, is it worth it? Is it worth that trade-off? Is it worth getting that promotion if your marriage is falling apart because you're never home on time? Is it worth the money if your health is poor? Is it worth the stability your job offers you if the rest of your life has become unstable? Is it worth having a convenient answer for the question, what do you do, if you feel like you should be doing something else? And if the answer is no, the next question you got to ask yourself is, what are you willing to let go of to make room for something else? Sometimes in life, you have to let go of part of your life to make room for the pursuit of something greater. And when I left my corporate marketing job, I had to be willing to let go of the steady paycheck and the credibility of being associated with a large brand so that I could make room for the pursuit of having a more direct and personal impact on the people in the world around me. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, Joseph, I don't know about that. My situation's not that great. Maybe the situation isn't right for me to make a move. Maybe my financial situation isn't correct. The timing's off. What do you say to that? Well, I say that the timing needs to be right for you, because changing directions in life and making a pivot is an enormous amount of investment and time, sometimes money. You have to really want it, and only you can know when the timing is right and the conditions are right. The great news is you get to draw the line. You get to decide. You get to decide when the conditions are good enough. You get to decide when the path forward is clear enough. You get to decide when your risk tolerance is high enough, and you get to decide when you have had enough. When the fear of the known is greater than the fear of the unknown, and when the idea of doing nothing seems riskier than the idea of doing something, when the thought of standing still is more agonizing to you than the thought of moving on, not because you know exactly where you want to go, but because you do know precisely it's not here. And because you do believe, at least broadly, that somewhere out there something better awaits you. In closing, as far as how things turned out for me, well, I can tell you that all these windy roads have definitely made for quite an adventure for me and a memorable journey. It's not over yet. But I can also tell you that it was worth it. Because right now, I wake up each morning and I can't wait to get my day started. Because I'm doing work that I feel is making the most of who I am, both personally and professionally. That I'm doing work that I care about, that I think is meaningful to me, and hopefully, therefore, in turn, meaningful to others. And I do believe that if you're willing to remain open to new roads, to embrace the chaos that comes your way when you cut your losses, and to bravely let go of one aspect of your life to make room for the pursuit of something greater, then this question of what do you do will be a nice reminder of the time that you chose to boldly relaunch your career in a way that has a positive impact on your life, the people in your life, and the world around you. Imagine what would be possible if you were to act on that one idea that has been lingering in the back of your mind for so long, to begin to rewrite the next chapter of your career. In fact, maybe to reshape the entire story of your career. How would your life change if you took that step? Thank you.